got to.
I'm going to reconvene us and just invite you all to turn around. We don't want to block the camera, but otherwise you're welcome to gather more closely, because we did intend this to be a conversation. And it's my hope that one of my ambitions with this was not only just to be able to share Natalie and to share with her some exchange of thoughts about the state of women's studies and gender studies and the study of sexuality and in our moment, the moment we're in now, but also to engage a group who I think would have a really interesting conversation with us about it. So I hope we'll move quickly to the point of engagement, because they're just a remarkable set of people here today. I'm not going to go around and introduce every one of them, but I think Natalie's had a chance to know who all is here. So my idea was just to start by situating us at Cal, in part because you were here and I am here and we're here, and to ask you, a somewhat provocative question by starting by saying, women have been at Cal and at the center of Cal since the beginning. I mean, this is not true of all universities. So this isn't a story of a university that was transformed in the post-war period by women. In fact, you could actually even say that women created Cal. I mean, when Danielle and I were thinking together about the deep history of this, I mean, we realized that Phoebe Hearst, Elizabeth Jocelyn Bolt, Jane Sather, I mean, these are the people who actually created this campus, and more recently, have been, women have been absolutely. It's not surprising in a way, since Babylonia, women have been central to philanthropy. But more recently, Doreen B. Townsend, who just transformed the landscape of campus for the humanities. And women were here from the beginning as students as well, at least the second year. There were no women in the entering class of Cal in 1869, but there were 8 women admitted in 1870 in the second entering class. And 8 is a fairly large proportion because there were only about 50 or 60 students. So that was not an insignificant, it would be unnoticeable today. And of course, they were also here, I learned, by doing a little investigation very early on as faculty members. And the first, Danielle and I did a little bit of research, and I tapped the brains of my colleague David Hollinger, who's a historian of the campus, at least that's one of his passions. And the first woman professor at Cal was hired in 1903 as a lecturer in sociology, Kim. But she went on to become, and her name was Jessica Picciotto. She was a Spanish Jew, which I'm somewhat proud of. And she was hired in 1903 as a lecturer in sociology, but went on to be the first tenured professor at Cal in economics.
Isn't that interesting?
But even another delicious twist in my little investigation is that actually she did her Ph.D. in the history department with Bernard Moses. And the topic of her Ph.D. dissertation was the French Revolution and the Advent of Socialism. And so we have a connection, Natalie, that's echoing over the centuries here. Something about the French historians and actually her research, and the reason what she was interested in the advent of socialism was an interest in the history of charity and social welfare, which of course is central to the story of how women have engaged and entered into public life. So my first question to you, really coming out of all of that, is, given that women have been here since the beginning, they were precocious a presence here at Cal, why in the 1970s, when you introduced, I believe, the first course in women's studies here at Cal in 73, I think?
72.
72, a course that has been emulated many times by many of your former students. But why did it seem so exigent to do that after, a century? I mean, in fact, it was almost a century later, after a century of the founding. Why did women's studies suddenly become so exigent if women were at Cal? So.
Well, the role of women, this professor of economics in 1908 or 1910 that's an extraordinary story to hear about her. But we weren't so numerous when I arrived here in January of 1972. I actually spent a year here, or half a year here, as a visiting professor in 1968. And those of you, anybody who may remember that you were perhaps a little too young then, that was a particularly perturbed period, an exciting period, and most of the graduate course that I had, we seemed to be online in front of the Army Induction Center in Oakland. We would all meet there. But so that was a somewhat different kind of experience, and I wouldn't address the question of gender particularly. We were so deeply concerned with the question of the war and the more general political questions. In '72, when I arrived, there were not many women faculty, at least with tenure. There were a lot of women extremely actively doing graduate studies in lectureship positions, but we were a very small number. And as I was reminiscing, and over lunch, you had just arrived, and I don't know how many students were in your department, whether you had many women faculty. But one of the things that seemed deeply important, quite apart from that course, was meeting the other women faculty and finding out what the situation was in their departments. We had a friend from anthropology, a friend from linguistics, there were some literary people, as I recall, and all of us felt that we wanted to have more women teaching among us, and we wanted to give as much possible encouragement to all of our graduate students, male and female, but we wanted to particularly make it a happy place for scholarship for our women students. And one of the things we did, we were again talking about this a little bit over lunch, this practice of networking, immediately getting to know the other women and men too, but we particularly wanted to know each other and compare notes. I came here, in terms of the teaching of women's studies, I came here having founded with Jill Kerr Conway, some of you may know her, Road from Corrane and her other works on women's education, having founded with her the first women's history course in Canada, and maybe one of the earlier ones. We had done it the year before, and carried with me the same, remember this is 1971, the same sense of excitement and exuberance about this as a field of study, the novelty of it, the importance of it, and the response that we got from the students who independently themselves were organizing student feminist studies courses. So I came with that experience just behind me. I think I just left one course and started it a few minutes later here. And maybe, I don't know, Allison, you were in that class. Well,
I scrounged around finding sources for you and Doe
and
Xerox.
I think I would describe it, I mean, in very much the same way, that there was, I didn't have other people who were particularly teaching women's history. I had colleagues who, in the history department, who thought it was a good idea, but I didn't have a group of us. I didn't have a Jill Kerr Conway particularly to work with in my own field. As I say, there were others. Pardon?
You worked with your graduates, female graduates.
With their
yes,
graduates.
yes. But there was an upsurge of both a feminist interest and certainly an interest among the students. So it seemed to me, as I say, it wasn't an initial response. I was going to come here and teach that course no matter what. but it was right. It was right to do it. It was in that particular moment. Just to reminisce about it, it was we didn't. I don't know whether other courses had tutors or preceptors, whatever or TAs. Maybe some of them did. We didn't. We were a large group. We met in a very large class, and Berkeley being what it was, I used to set up a kind of seminar after every lecture in that coffee house. Mm-hmm. I can't remember. Yes, and we would just meet there, and we actually. There were
Cafe
maybe
Espresso, yeah.
maybe 125 people in the class or so. I've forgotten the number, but we would meet as a group of maybe 10. Maybe some people, such as Alice, who came very often, and a few others, but others would come at least once during the class. So we had a kind of very interesting discourse in which we talked about some of the scholarly issues in the class, but also people brought up their experiences as women. That they were, I don't know that we had only a few men in the course, which I sort of, I'll come back to this perhaps. So we always regretted, because I've always felt this is a course, we called it Society and the Sexes.
Yes, that's what I was going to ask you about. I mean,
Yes.
you know, you taught a women's history course, but you and Jill decided to call it Society and the Sexes,
yes.
which has really become,
Yes.
as I said, a kind of institution, and it's been iterated all over the country. But why did you choose
Well,
to call it Society and the Sexes rather than the history of women?
Because, I mean, women were, of course, central actors in the story and in the course. There could well have been more men in the class. But a woman is a category which is part of a relationship between women and men. And though we didn't use the term gender, built into this class was the notion that that what it meant to be a woman or a man in the 16th century. I did the early modern part. Jill took it up for America. Really, what we had wasn't just simply random, because the body was part of our course, and we early had someone come in from a sympathetic person from biology to talk a little bit about it, but as we did at Princeton later on. But that it was a course in which we were interested in both male roles, as we would call it very often, female roles. We were interested in men's behavior and women's. Everything was going to be looked at relationally. We were interested both in women's relationship to other women and women's relationship to men.
I remember you wrote that beautiful essay in that period of time for Past and Present called Women's Studies in Transition, in which you talked about needing to write a history of the sexual differences rather than a history of women, that it was always had to be a relational history.
It seemed very central to be relational, and somehow I seem to have used the word gender in that particular essay, though I don't know whether it was current or not. But at any rate,
It probably came from anthropology.
maybe, because it is true that that in my own case, the importance of in my own particular scholarly trajectory, the importance of teaching about women and gender, men and women, was very connected. It happened exactly at the same time in my work that I had turned to historical anthropology, exactly at the same moment. And just to suggest this in my own case, the same year that I wrote a social history paper on women in the Protestant Reformation, which looked at that as a kind of sociological question, which women became Protestant, urban women, and so forth. I wrote Women on Top, which is a sort of anthropological study, of a symbolic study, with, of course, the sexual implication was completely intentional, that was not a mistake, of rites of inversion, such as the Charivari. And that was another important thing about the field at that time. It was one of the vanguard fields. It was already the case in Toronto, and certainly the case here, in which interdisciplinary work was being done. There was no way that we could do the study of women and men and of women's history, gender history. There was just no way you could do it without having, just even for your source material, even to know what to assign the students. But analytically, it did demand that, and that made it a particularly exciting scholarly enterprise.
I thought it might be nice for you to talk a little bit about what some of the results of plowing into the study of women were for our understanding of the past. In other words, how, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you feel that coming to look at the past and historical experience from the point of view of women transform the way we understand history and the past. And I was thinking in particular of course, The Return of Martin Guerre, which is a book that we all know. And one of the things that seemed remarkable about that book was that your point of departure was not Martin Guerre,
But was Bertrand.
but was really his wife,
Yeah,
Bertrand de
yes,
Rhodes. And
yes.
maybe you could talk a little bit about
Yes,
that.
and that's a particularly apt book to mention, since I discovered it here. I started working on it here at at Berkeley
Huh.
when a seminar on family, kin, and you see there again, the seminar was on family, kin, and social structure in early modern France. One of the students was working on the theme of adoption, and it turned out a book by a man named Jean de Carras about Martin Guerre had one paragraph on that subject, and she said, "Gee, this is an interesting book." So
And she brought it to you.
and she it's at the Rare Book Library at the law school, and she didn't bring it to me. I had to go over to the law school. Doesn't circulate. But I thought this is a terrific book. But in this study of imposture, where for centuries there had been popular writing about it, it had been seen. There hadn't been any scholarly writing about it, but then in popular writing and some wonderful novels and plays and poetry. It was always seen from the point of view of the imposter, and as the sentence in the case suggested, although the sentence is more complicated than it suggests on the surface, he had completely deceived this woman. Bracket, you can see how if he has completely deceived this woman, she can be declared innocent if you want to save the family and the children that were born from it. So, but at least on the surface, and all the writing was about this. How could a body, people would wonder, how could in the sexual intimacy that they had for 3 or 4 years, how could she mistake the body and the sexual style? And that was one of the questions that was even asked in the court case, indirectly. How could you make that mistake? I was sure to get a line on that into the movie, the film that we made. At any rate, but it was thinking about her, starting with her rather than starting with the traditional story, and thinking about how a peasant woman lived when she'd been abandoned by her husband, and about the kinds of strategies that families needed, and that whole enterprise took off, and which then led to, that is, it started out with an insight, and then of course had to be filled in with a great deal of research in the archives. So the study of the sexes, gender history, the study of women, has made a difference, certainly in my scholarship. I'll give only one more example and then think more generally about the field, that my own turn to thinking about my own critique of, and this would be true of other people, I bet it's true of you too as well, Karen, my own critique of the evolutionary modernization theory, one straight path, the present, England is the model, or whatever. My critique of that way of looking at history, which when I was a graduate student and still a young scholar, when I was just beginning my history teaching, was very important in our field. And it affected people looking at development, people working in my first critique of that came in trying to think about how women fit into these categories, these stage theories of change. There was a famous article that many of you will have used or remember very early along when one of our colleagues talked about, did women have a renaissance? And in fact, as a matter of fact, they did in a sense, but just asking that question. So that has made a great deal of difference, not just in my thinking about gender, but in my thinking, in all my work, since I actually moved from European history, in looking at North African history and whatever I've looked at. I mean, this is something that for you, Beth, would just be second. I mean, being a scholar of Japan, you will have already have been there. But for us coming from Europe, it required some kind of a shock. And it was thinking about how gender works in different societies and recognizing, for instance, that you could see a Protestant style of both female constraint but female expressiveness, and a Catholic style and something and a Jewish style, simultaneous. That these were alternate ways of moving from one period to another. When I think of my European field, there are a few things that are just unthinkable now in doing history. And I think they are now part of world history textbooks, that are part of introductory textbooks. Even though there's a lot more work to do, let me just say that it seems to me impossible to talk about what we used to call state building, the establishment of modern political institutions, without all the material on the role of the family, welfare, the history of charity and philanthropy. All of these issues are just now part of thinking about it. There's still controversial issues. It's not that everything's been solved, but that is part of the picture. It is impossible now to work on the history of what we no longer call the Industrial Revolution, but when I first started to teach economic history, we were still called, but modern forms of economic change. It seems it's not impossible to do it without really taking seriously the meaning of women and children in the labor force. That was part of the story before, because if you were talking about, say, English legislation on child labor.
And even really the unremunerated labor of household goods.
Yes.
As Jan de Vries, I think, is
yes,
so important.
You look at the household. There is no way now with all the work, I think, on the history of consumption, the new work on consumption, on luxury and dress, which was sort of bracketed off as a subject, is now part of the history of commercial capitalism and economic change. So those are areas that really have been transformed. Yeah. I think there's a huge amount to do still along this line.
Well, maybe I can draw you to that train of thought from a slightly different angle, which is to say, when you came here, there were very few women, and part of making the Women's Studies program here was about creating a place for women at Cal, particularly the women who were going to be here their whole careers, but also the students who were passing through. But now we have, remarkably, I was just brushing up on that. We have 53% of our students are women, and I didn't really realize this until I wouldn't have guessed it. I would have put the number, 42% of our faculty now are women.
Wow, that's a big change.
And we have a remarkable number of women in leadership positions. And we have right here with us our Vice Chancellor for everything except the provostal line, Kathy Koshlin. And we have numerous chairs of departments, including my own chair, who is actually the first woman chair of the history department. So things maybe haven't changed as fast as we might imagine, but we have the chair of sociology and of women's studies and former chair of the Department of Anthropology here. So do we still need to be doing this, I guess, is the question. Things have changed. Should we just declare victory and say, and go home?
I don't.
So what's left to be done, I guess?
I don't think so. Let's leave aside just scholarly reflection and so forth, and just think about the undergraduate students. At the University of Toronto right now, where I'm now have been living since I left Princeton in the last decade, the majority of our students are from families that were not born in Canada, and they come from. Perhaps you know about Toronto. They come from all over, and they have not had courses about the history of women and gender in high school. Maybe a few of those who've gone to private school, yes. Private schools are definitely, a few private schools definitely are doing that. And a few of the high schools and there's a little bit. But those young women, and in some cases men, but here again it's mostly women, are packing our undergraduate course on, I'm not sure what they call it, but let's say the history of women and gender, whatever it's called. And it's taught, it may be taught in a kind of standard traditional way with certain, I'm sure that they have opened it up globally, so that there is some non-Western material that's urgent. But these young women are coming from Pakistan backgrounds, Indian backgrounds, Chinese backgrounds, Korean backgrounds, you name it, and plus all the Balkans, all parts of Europe. And the course brings them together as women. It doesn't obscure differences among them. And they learn something about relations that are deeply important, both in their families, in their communities, and as citizens of Canada. I can't believe that there isn't something similar here, that you have a mixed population with the same, the California or US version of exactly, I haven't been away that long, but it's first of all, it's the students, it's good for the students, just their morale to be in this class. As I say, the classes are packed, and it's important for them to have some kind of narrative, which might not be unchangeable, but some kind of a narrative to think about women's position and the whole issue of gender and men and women in the world today. So I really think that those are not to be closed down. I think that it's deeply important that these students also have connections with their departments, but they all do. So that's on that score, and we also have, and again, I don't know the situation here, women's studies majors, not as widely dispersed in different departments. I think that our program, in terms of its advanced work, has become more associated with, well, and nothing wrong with sociology, but where was the sociology? No, there's nothing wrong with it. But it's just there's nothing wrong at all. But I think that you're more likely to find the majors are maybe going to be more likely to be from, say, sociology than, say, medieval history. Even though we have juniors and seniors doing very interesting work in medieval women, but somehow in terms of that, at that level, at the third and fourth year, I think they're maybe because they've picked up the gender perspective and they can do it on their own in, say, medieval history or in French literature, what have you. It's just that there's the third and fourth year students are tending to come more from certain departments than others. Maybe it would be. I'm sorry, I'm using Toronto as an example, but if that is the case here, it could be that with that more cooperative activity between disciplines and the women's studies program would lead to, say, conferences and so forth for advanced undergraduates. But at any rate,
well, I know you've reflected, and I recommend this book, A Passion for History, that Natalie has just, her most recent book, which is a series of conversations with the wonderful French historian Denis Crouzet on her thoughts about history. And I know in here there's a chapter on women, and
yes.
And you reflected a lot there on the need for continuing to have not only a women's studies curriculum at the undergraduate level, but also a major as an option. But you also had some interesting thoughts about advanced study, let's just say at the graduate level, and I'm wondering if you would want to share some of these thoughts, and I'll send people, before I open the floor up.
I have a somewhat different reflection from the what I said about the undergraduate. When I said that I thought that a traditional course, it could be innovative, so in women's history and gender was just essential for undergraduates. Just get it out there for a start, but widened by non-European and non-American materials. I would have a somewhat different approach to graduate training and different kinds of institutes. And maybe this is happening here. I think they're extremely important, but I think that if there's any going to be any new crafting and thinking about new ways of constructing the field and new kinds of connections that the field could have with other disciplines, I mean deeply important connections. The whole question of the integration of sexuality into the way it can play a role seems to me extremely important and creative, a very, very creative thing. See, when the way in which that is going to be integrated into an introductory course, especially in an introductory course taught in Toronto with the students, that's another matter. I think it should be there. But it certainly, there should be a lot of creative thinking about the range of ways of doing sexual history, how it would fit into an institute. I think its presence at an institute or an institute for advanced graduate study, is important. Again, I'm probably speaking to things that you're doing here, but there still may be work to do. The internationalizing of the program and the working from non-Western models. We've heard this, we heard this from our colleagues already. I remember back, my Dutch friends were already saying this to me 20 years ago. Why are you bringing over an American model for us to talk about our gender history isn't like your gender history? And of course, if I was getting that from the Netherlands, what are we going to, from our Asian colleagues, our Indian colleagues? They've already been saying to this at the last Berk's Women's History meeting. They were saying, we read what you do, why don't you read what we do? And see how it applies to your own, at least plug it in, or see if it applies some of the models that we're developing. That seems to me extraordinarily important, that kind of transformation. And I think that as I say, not just internationalizing it, but really drawing upon the theoretical work, critically to be sure, but drawing upon it for our own work. The thing that I worried about here, and that I noticed at least in some advanced programs, was there seemed to be a time recycling of the same set of ideas. In fact, some of the students in our introductory graduate course said that they had been reading the same theoretical text in their second year, in their advanced year, and they were reading it again in graduate school. In other words, the same, and it sort of isn't like, Plato or something, where, it wasn't like a huge corpus. When I began to hear that from graduate students, I thought, now this isn't good. We need something to, we really have to rethink.
Ventilation. Yeah.
The final thing I'd say, and this is my choice about a graduate thing. I don't know that everybody here would agree, but I have felt it was important for my own students and for myself. And that would be to have both a foot both in a discipline where you learn the tools of your craft, whether it's working on a certain way of working on archives or a certain way of doing field work or a certain way of working in a laboratory, but you get those particular skills and that body of theoretical information and conflicts, because of course every field is built around conflicts, together with an advanced degree in women and gender studies. I prefer that in my own work. I've actually always tried to move back and forth between these two different ways. That is, sometimes entering a subject without a gender question at its fore. This happened to me in my book on the gift in 16th century France, a book on gifts, charity, bribes, and so forth, where I entered with the gift as a theme. And sure enough, along the way, gender turned up. Maybe not surprising, but it was partly because I didn't enter with my usual sets of questions. I entered with something else. And I find that in my own case and in my own students, I have felt that double thing. So that doesn't mean that you don't have advanced courses, graduate courses, but that they're renewed and that at least one thinks about the possibility. They're expanded so that the field includes, for instance, sexuality, geographically expanded, and at least one takes very seriously the possibility of working both in a discipline as well as in the interdisciplinary women's studies.
I can see people putting their hands up. I want to pitch in, and so what I'd like to do is just close our conversation or open our conversation more appropriately to the room and invite. You've put a lot of provocative and, of course, wonderful ideas on the table. And okay. Or we could take the move the microphone. Maybe that would be better.
Oh, is it?
Yeah. Just.
A jiggly around.
Yeah, I didn't know you were going to be so
Then you didn't know, Natalie. Ruth.
Thank you, Carla. Thank you, Natalie.
Yeah. It's recording. It's just recording.
I've lectured to 400 people without a microphone. I wanted to add some reminiscences. When I was starting to do women's history at Berkeley before Natalie came, before the Great Blessing came. And that was in 1969 and 70. And I was doing it in American history, but of course not knowing what I was doing, and there was no one to really guide me to think about the kinds of methods and so forth. I would like to just remind people that even in American history, I was the only woman in every graduate seminar I took in those years. And then when Natalie arrived in 1972, my world was, of course, blessed and changed completely, because then I had someone to guide me and teach me and to really help me. But there really was no one who was doing anything about gender before she arrived, and we overlapped by a few years, and I thank you forever for what you did. And then I went to UC Davis, where when I left, there were about 10 different scholars in 10 different continents, doing various kinds of gendered work. And I wanted to just say that it seemed to me that one of the good things that changed since the years that we both taught at Berkeley. I was teaching a 101 senior research seminar in 1970 on women's history, American women's history. And when I had a little dinner party for my graduate students, the undergraduates, they all brought different colored Jell-O molds because they thought it was not cool to cook. And so we had, little squirmy little Jell-O. By the time I left Davis, and it's true here too, the course I teach is Gender Matters in the 20th century. Men do take our courses much more than they did then, and that was something I so regretted too, that we couldn't get women and men to take the courses in equal numbers during the first few years. Anyway, thank you, Natalie, for changing my life.
I'm very happy to hear that story about because the courses I always thought were just great courses in history and social history and cultural history and should be of interest to both.
I think I still have some mimeograph copies of your translations of Poulain de la Barre.
Yes.
Of, run through the past hands, passed over hand by hand. I'm sure someone's transcribed them into a computer by now, but in those days it really was about translating texts that just weren't even available.
It's true. We had to create a kind of corpus for people to read.
Well, on that note, maybe just talk. Oh, go ahead, Karis. Yeah.
So, this is really fabulous. Thank you to both of you. It's just so exciting to be here. I'm the new chair of Gender and Women's Studies. Come out of a different discipline. I found it. Sorry. Just as I've come from a different institution and found Berkeley, and now, of course, wouldn't be anywhere else. Because it's a public university anyway. These things get under your skin, and gender studies has done that to me. We have a couple of barriers to doing the wonderful ideas that you were suggesting. It's very hard to team teach, and this kind of thing you're talking about, starting these classes where someone does the early modern and someone else does a more contemporary half to the class. It just sounds so exciting, but it's very hard to do it here. Or that you could have half your line in your disciplinary base and half your line in gender studies, but really thrive intellectually. And I just wondered if you had, I know it's really nitty-gritty and practical, but how you can live your administrative life in such a way that your intellectual dreams can happen.
Is it difficult here for technical reasons or reasons of departmental rule, or you mean just how does it work it out as?
Right now is like that, and I'm down here, and I keep falling backwards, so I don't really know.
Well, as your dean, I'd say just do it.
So it's
Of
So
course,
it's
of course, it's so funny people think you can't do things that you
so it's
can.
technically quite possible.
Sure.
You just need to find a teammate. Ed.
No, I think you're right, though, that team teaching is so central to any kind of interdisciplinary program. And Tom and I, we did decide we were going to revive your course, and we did so with Mary Ryan, which was she was our Jill Kerr-Conway, and we in Europe and America from the Enlightenment to the present, and we did it as a 3-ring circus. And the way we persuaded our chair, who was not the current chair, to let us do that was just to say, look, we'll bring in 3 times the enrollment, so you can have us teaching 3 classes with 40 people or 3 classes with 150, and it was persuasive.
So does that solve the problem? Can we
get your syllabus?
At Princeton, here there weren't enough of us yet to do it in that particular year. But at Princeton, when I taught women's history at Princeton, but then we started a women's studies program, and we did co-teach that. I taught it the first time. You were a TA at one point in that class. The first time I taught it with an anthropologist, and one would take one day. We wouldn't teach, and the other would take the next. And then at the end of each class, you would have 5 minutes to comment on your perspective on that material. And I think these students, enjoyed it. I mean, it does. It requires a lot of teamwork, but it's very engaging intellectually, and so you got the go ahead on that one.
Karen.
I have an observation that I would like to share, which is that in the beginning of women's and gender studies, historians were very deeply involved. more recently, it seems that there are many programs in which the historians aren't particularly involved, or very little, and the curriculum of these programs seems to tend toward very current events or to very highfalutin theory.
Yeah.
I have nothing against theory, but it seems to me that the history needs to be there in order to give depth as well as breadth. I don't know what the situation here is at Berkeley at the moment, but I've seen this other places. Perhaps maybe Carla could comment on that, but Natalie too, in the course of your long experience, have you noticed this to be a problem?
The existence of women's history courses in a history department, I think right. But that I just want to make that clear that really is present. Your observation certainly fits to some extent with the experience at Toronto, which I talked about a little bit more in terms of when I said it was more associated with some departments. There is our wonderful, one of our wonderful American historians is in the Women's Studies program as well as in the history department, but she's the only one. So that the big course on women's history is taught in the history department, but is not part of the women's. I'm sure that people who are interested in women's studies are encouraged to go, but I think that is an interesting question, and that is a challenge to the directors of women's studies programs to try to, if you can't do it in terms of formal curriculum, to establish settings where the people, and they're probably all over this, I'm sure they're all over the Berkeley campus, including in the philosophy department and all over, are brought together occasionally to exchange the minimum information about what they're doing and maybe having some certain kinds of events, social events, scholarly events, so that they at least know each other. I think that is, I would agree with you that that's a problem.
Yeah, and there's at least two things associated with that. I think on the one hand, there's a sense that the larger departments can and will already hire in those fields, and so you don't need to. Gender studies, women's studies department becomes a kind of residualist place, a place to get people that you couldn't get otherwise, because the mainstream disciplines won't take them, even though they're excellent in X, or whatever it might be. And then also a kind of aspect that we usually call, as you know, third wave, that is I want to say ignorant response to second wave, which is always gets overblown into a rejection of the disciplines associated with what gets historicized, insofar as it is historicized, which is not very far at all, around disciplines like history, like English, and it's associated with white women, it's associated with Euro and American centrism, and it's considered to be to exclude women of color, it's considered to exclude sexuality studies, it's considered to be not intersectional enough, and too essentialist, and so on and so forth. Much of which, if you actually read the text, turns out not to be the case, or even when it is the case, to be the case in a very, very interesting set of ways. But getting through the door, and so there's a kind of push and a pull set of phenomena where post-colonial theory, transnational feminisms, queer of color theory, and things become the texts that are the kind of go-to places. So I see push and pull in that regard.
Yeah, thanks. This is a problem that's been around almost from the beginning. The separation and sometimes conflict between women's studies programs or departments and the study of women in the disciplines. In the early years, it was less of a problem because there weren't very many people in the disciplines. And if been left to them, probably women's studies would not have developed in the way that it did. But there's a real problem over conflict for resources, for prestige, and so on, which tend to flow along traditional departmental lines and women's studies programs. So much so that there are places around universities where there is a move to eliminate women's studies programs as such on the basis, well, we don't need that because people are teaching women's studies in all these fields. But it seems to me, based on my experience, which goes back a long way, that for undergraduate students especially, women's studies programs and departments play an important formative role, give them a place to learn about the various disciplines, to share, to interact, to develop interdisciplinary perspectives and so on that serve them very well, no matter what they go on to do, that just taking a course in women's history in a women's studies department does not do.
In listening to all of this, I'm struck by the word intersectional. I like that. That seems like a wonderful way to think about the women's studies department here and the challenge of creating a department that's a kind of vibrant crossroad for not just the faculty in it, but to draw in, and the challenge I think is to draw in, to see it as a kind of portal for and the place where a kind of a focal point for research and teaching that's going on all over. So it's an enabling space for intersectional exchange, and I think that's a wonderful vision looking forward. And because we're going to run out of time here, and I know other people have appointments, I just want to give you a chance to say a few words about, if we're looking forward here at Berkeley, what are the kinds of things you would see us looking forward to? I mean, what would be, if some thoughts you would have about how to move forward in this vibrant research area that is now thriving all over the campus?
Well, as you were speaking, and as you think of your new role, I was thinking about not only the possibility of a new kind of outreach, not only dispelling some of these false notions of the program, but a new kind of outreach to different people on the campus, with maybe some kind of an exciting conference of renewal, and secondly, something that might create a lot of community interest as well, and that worked at Toronto, where our last chair of the program, Women's Studies, it's called a program there, but it is now becoming a department, was a woman from an Iranian refugee family. And I think that they have developed a kind of new either fellowship or professorship in which which will be held by someone from some non-Western part of the world. And this has caused great excitement, just the idea that someone was going to come in and bring this non-Western perspective. I mean, it would be, I don't know all the details of it. Perhaps you could think of, not only building on what you've been doing, which sounds very impressive from everything I've heard, but perhaps some kinds of renewal that would...
short-term one for a scholar from China, but that is exactly the kind of thing we're thinking about.
And I think that something like this also would have, perhaps you've already have a considerable community outreach, but perhaps that might be something to think about as well, and find, and not just perhaps in the undergraduate level, but people that would be interested in some of the more advanced programs that you had. Those would be some of the suggestions that I have. And the community outreach might be important because, just because, at least where I come from, the whole question in families in our community about the word feminism. Young people say, well, I went not long ago and addressed actually in this case it was a private girls' high school, but because the dean of the English, the literary part of the school said, our girls don't even want to talk about being feminist. So I didn't use the word, but I talked about how the issues that would come up, I just decided not to use the word, but that the issues that would come up, many that we've been talking about, in terms of their own goals, in terms of their own lives, would require their paying attention to the fact that they were women. They would just have, I mean, they were totally interested in some of the other aspects, but motherhood and jobs and so forth. So when I speak about something that might be quite interesting and innovating, but also could bring the community in, it might be because some of these issues would be important to the next generation and to the young mothers who are raising daughters and sons. So those would be some ideas that that I would share, and that I would hope would get support from faculty and community people.
One thing that I was thinking just listening to today is that, history doesn't always move forward unless people move it, And so we're so pleased that you've come here and helped us to continue to make this move here. And it's been an occasion in any event to assemble a group of people, I think, who care and
who made a lot of difference in this community.
Who have made a lot of difference in this community, and who don't often have the opportunity to gather together. And so thank you.
Well, thank
so
you
much
for inviting me.
that. The gift that keeps on giving.